This year, the summer was truly hot. People walking down the street hurried to find shelter from the scorching rays of the sun. The asphalt heated up so much that it began to melt. Suddenly, a car drove by, spraying water. A dog ran behind it, wagging its tail, rejoicing in the small relief from the heat. Although it was blistering outside, in the office belonging to a bottled water company, it was hot for a different reason. It was the peak of the season. Sales had skyrocketed, and employees were bustling around fulfilling orders. The air conditioners were running at full blast, but it didn't help much. The panting and sweating manager from the 5th floor entered the planning department to deliver some papers. To her surprise, there was a calm atmosphere here. But suddenly, one of the 3 girls working here jumped up indignantly and said, "Who stole my candy again? Can't you just stop?" She looked around angrily, but everyone remained silent, apparently used to such scenes. The girl's name was Sophia. She threw a menacing glance first at the 2 guys, then at her neighbor. But the strangest thing was that she didn't suspect the slender girl with dark curly hair sitting in the corner. It seemed like nobody noticed her. The girl's name was Anna. She had been working at this company for 5 years already, but hadn't managed to make friends with anyone during that time. The manager who had just come in handed her the papers, silently placing them on the table, and left. Anna was used to such treatment. Since childhood, everyone ignored her. Even in the orphanage where she grew up, the bullies avoided her. She always wanted social interaction, but it seemed like an insurmountable barrier. Approaching someone and starting a conversation was something fantastic for her. She thought that after school, her life would change. But it didn't happen. Neither in the cheap college nor at the new job, where she was also unnoticed. It had become the norm for her. Her reaction to the noisy colleague was only irritation. In fact, she had long wanted to change jobs, but her love for one person stopped her. His name was Edward. He worked in their finance department as an analyst. Sitting in her corner, she sneakily glanced at him. Seeing his blonde, well-groomed hair, neat nose, and beautiful smile, she sighed quietly. Yes, he was handsome. But Anna loved him not only for that. He was very kind. One of the few who noticed her and tried to communicate with her. Every time she tried to talk to him, her throat seemed to tighten, and she just walked past. Next to Edward sat James. That was someone Anna didn't like. He was silent and arrogant. Every time their eyes met, he turned his head away as if seeing her made him sick. He was a brunette, tall and quite handsome. Many girls in the company secretly sighed over him, but she wasn't one of them. You could even say he annoyed her. But most of all, she hated Sophia. She was a beautiful girl sitting opposite her desk. Next to her was her chubby friend Sarah. These two were always together like those high school girlfriends from teen movies. Sarah was quite sweet and open, unlike Sophia, who was somewhat arrogant, but only until she talked to Edward. Then she immediately changed, turning into a fragile and vulnerable victim. She really liked him, so she often hovered around him, trying to attract his attention. This greatly annoyed Anna. And this time Sophia began complaining to him about the theft of her sweets. They were special expensive candies that she liked to buy at a luxury store. She ate 1 or 2 pieces a day. Someone constantly took a couple of them from her cupboard. Then it was time to listen to her whining and complaints. Edward tried to comfort her, promising that they would go to that store together and he would buy her more. She still got what she wanted, Anna thought spitefully to herself. But then she took the papers that were brought to her and immersed herself in her work. Time flew by quickly, and the end of the day came, but everyone in the department decided to stay late at work. Tomorrow was a day off, and they needed to wrap up all the pending tasks. When it was 8 o'clock on the clock, Sophia was the first to get up and, stretching, suggested to everyone to go for dinner at a nice restaurant. Sarah agreed first, then they looked at Edward with pleading eyes, and he had to agree too. Then the three of them surrounded James, who apparently didn't want to go, but he sighed, got up, and followed them. But before they left, Edward stopped and said, "What about Anna? Shouldn't we invite her?" Sophia made a puzzled grimace, as if not understanding whom he was talking about, but then, as if remembering her, she turned to her. "Anna, don't you want to go with us?" But she shook her head in refusal. Then Edward started persuading her, and she couldn't resist anymore. The five of them left the building and headed down the street to the place. The daytime heat had subsided a bit, and it was much more pleasant to walk along the street. The empty streets filled with people made Anna feel uncomfortable. She walked behind the whole group, trying not to lag behind. The guys chatted cheerfully, discussing various topics and rejoicing at the end of this tough week. Finally, they arrived at the right place. It was a small Mexican restaurant which lured with its cozy atmosphere. Bright colors dominated the interior. Orange and red walls were decorated with colorful ornaments and traditional Mexican wall paintings. In the corner, the gentle sound of a guitar played, adding a special flavor to the evening. Small wooden tables were covered with tablecloths in the national style, and on each of them stood small vases with green cacti. The waiter in bright national clothes smiled at them and pointed to a free table by the window, from where there was a view of a cozy courtyard with lush plants and twinkling lights. Taking their seats, the five colleagues started to choose dishes. Anna sat in the corner, trying not to disturb anyone. She looked at the menu, not knowing what to order. In fact, she didn't like spicy food, but she was embarrassed to say so. Then Edward asked her, smiling widely, what she wanted, and she nervously pointed to the first dish she saw. "Oh, you like spicy," he said, placing the order. When the food arrived, Anna tried a piece and realized that it was really very spicy, but Edward kept looking at her, and she swallowed another piece. When her face turned red from the heat, she waved her hand to her face, trying to cool down. Then he noticed it and handed her water. How sweet he is, after all, Anna thought to herself. Sophia noticed this small scene and decided to divert attention to herself by starting to tell some funny story that happened to her. Occasionally, she threw spiteful glances at Anna, which made her uncomfortable. With time, the first dishes were eaten, washed down with alcohol, and they ordered more food. A relaxing atmosphere settled at the table. Sophia was already quite drunk and began making unmistakable signs to Edward, whispering something in his ear or touching him with her hands. But he seemed not to mind. Everyone laughed and had fun, except Anna. Watching them, she gritted her teeth and clenched her fists with anger. Sophia's advances toward Edward infuriated her. She could barely contain herself. And the worst thing for her was that he accepted all these intimate hints without trying to distance himself from her. The last straw for her was when Sophia accidentally kissed him. Anna jumped up from her seat, startling her colleagues, and said she needed to go to the restroom, then left. Standing in front of the mirror, she tried to compose herself, but scenes with these two kept popping up in her head. She was filled with rage, something gnawed at her, and an unpleasant lump constricted her chest. She decided to leave to stop torturing herself. Walking out into the hall, she headed towards the table, where James was coming towards her, holding a portion of burrito generously covered in sauce. When they met, he suddenly slipped, and the dish fell right on her, spreading sauce all over her shirt. Anna stood there stunned, looking at herself. Then she looked at James, whose eyes were wide open, but she saw no remorse in them. Rage engulfed her, and she was about to scream when her gaze fell on Edward, who was being hugged by Sophia. Then she just turned around and rushed out of the restaurant. There were cries behind her, but she paid no attention. Hurrying along the already dark street, Anna clenched her fists in anger, cursing everyone, including herself, for agreeing to go with them. She kept replaying the scenes of the evening in her mind, but for some reason, she wasn't as angry about being splattered with sauce. She was more furious with Sophia. She called her all sorts of names in her mind and recalled her flaws. Unnoticed, she found herself on a dark, unlit alley. The boiling point was reached. Anna wound herself up so much that she involuntarily exclaimed, "May she die, may they hang her on a rope and gouge her eyes out." After shouting these curses, she calmed down. It seemed like she managed to vent her anger. Then, looking around, she realized with relief that she was alone on the street and no one had seen her outburst. Gathering her strength, she headed towards her home. Standing on the porch and searching for her keys, she involuntarily looked around. It was the house left to her by her parents. They died when she was little. It was her sanctuary. On the porch stood a wooden rocking chair and a couple of flowers in vases. She thought she should water them tomorrow and finally calmed down as she entered the house. In the morning, waking up early, she headed to work. Yesterday's incident was still fresh in her memory, but Anna decided not to dwell on it. She thought that when she came to work, everything would clear up, and it would turn out that there was nothing serious between Edward and Sophia. The office was not far from her home, just a couple of blocks away. When she approached the building, there was no one here yet, only the security guard stood at the entrance. She walked past, and he just glanced up and then lowered his gaze back to his phone. Entering the atrium, she turned left towards the fire escape. She often used it not to attract attention. She needed to go to the third floor. When she reached it, she stopped to catch her breath. A thought flashed through her mind that she should start exercising. Then she moved on and pushed the door leading to the hallway. Suddenly, she abruptly stopped. Covering her mouth with her hand out of fright, she took 2 steps back. Before her was a horrible scene that made her tremble. Unwilling to believe what was happening, she fainted from shock. The phone rang early in the morning, causing Detective Harris to curse tiredly. He finally had a weekend off after a tough case, but apparently something had happened again. There was even a fleeting thought in his mind whether he should just ignore it and not answer, but he still reached out and grabbed his cell phone. It was his boss calling. Pressing the answer button, he said hello in a sleepy voice, but he was immediately interrupted. The boss ordered him to come urgently to the scene, and he was supposed to send the address. Putting down the phone, the detective cursed again and went to the bathroom. He arrived at the scene half an hour later. It was a large business office, a 10-story building. Opposite the entrance stood police officers organizing a cordon. Curious onlookers had gathered nearby, guessing what had happened there. The detective approached the entrance, showing his ID, and was led to the crime scene. He took the elevator to the 3rd floor and walked down the corridor towards the fire exit, where forensic experts and other police officers had gathered. As he squeezed between them, a horrific scene unfolded before him. A girl was hanging from a rope tied to the ceiling. She must have been a beauty before, but now it was terrifying to look at her. The rope tightened around her neck, her hands hung down, and various bruises were visible all over her body. But the most horrifying thing was that her eyes were gouged out. When he looked at her, it seemed like the emptiness instead of her eyes dragged you into the abyss. The detective cursed and asked the chief what had happened here. It turned out that one of her colleagues discovered the body when she was climbing up the fire escape. She fainted upon seeing it, but another passing employee found them both a little later. He asked if they had checked the cameras. One of the police officers nodded in agreement, after which he led him to the surveillance room. Surprisingly, many law enforcement officers had gathered there. The detective noticed shock and horror on their faces. He asked everyone to disperse and also started watching the footage. It seemed like nothing was happening. It was night, and the corridors were empty. But suddenly one of the windows opened and the body flew in. It seemed lifeless, but suddenly the girl moved her arms. Her eyes were already gouged out, and she seemed to be screaming, but the camera didn't capture any sound. She flew through the corridor as if carried by an unknown ghost until she reached the place where the rope was already hanging. Then something put the rope around her neck and hung her, causing her to twitch and eventually hang lifelessly. The detective couldn't believe his eyes. It was the first time he had seen something like this. Uncontrollable tremors ran through him. What was this? A ghost, a poltergeist, or something even worse? He tried to find an explanation. Perhaps the footage was fabricated. There were plenty of freaks nowadays who were willing to go to such horrible lengths for sensation. So he composed himself and decided to conduct a detailed investigation. He returned to the crime scene, intending to talk to the girl who found the body. She was sitting in the adjacent room, being examined by a psychologist. She was a 25-year-old girl of small stature with curly gray hair. She wore glasses and appeared to be a typical introvert. He began asking her questions, but she didn't respond immediately, as if in a trance. The detective realized she was in shock, so he tried to be as gentle as possible. In the end, it turned out that she worked with the victim in the same department and found the body entirely by chance. Listening to her answers, he didn't detect anything suspicious, but for some reason, his gut feeling told him otherwise. Something was off, and he intended to find out what it was. Anna was released from questioning a couple of hours later. Seeing her condition, the officer drove her home. She quietly entered the house and, reaching her bedroom, flopped onto the bed. What she saw today shocked her, but she was more frightened by the fact that her curses from yesterday had come true. It was as if someone had eavesdropped and fulfilled her wish. What could it be? At that moment, there seemed to be no one on the street. Maybe someone was following her? Or did she acquire some terrifying superpower? But whatever it was, Sophia was dead. How would her colleagues react to this? She was particularly concerned about what Edward would think. At first, she felt sorry for Sophia, but then a feeling of satisfaction began to awaken in her, as if secretly inside her, her secret desire had come true, and then a spark of hope appeared. Maybe now she could succeed with Edward. The main thing now was to pretend to be a victim and get closer to him. She gradually started to forget the morning incident and began to imagine how she would date him. The funeral took place the next day. Anna didn't want to go, but then she thought it would look bad in the eyes of others, so she went after all. There were many people at the cemetery. She saw Sarah, who was crying while sitting on a chair, and James, who had a shocked expression on his face. Edward stood next to the deceased's parents and was discussing something. Everyone had sad faces. The funeral passed quickly, and when it was over, Anna got up and headed for the exit. But then Edward caught up with her. He didn't say anything, but simply hugged her. At that moment, she felt happy. Could it be that they were getting closer to each other? Finally, he let her go and said, "It must have been terribly difficult for you to see that scene, But you must stay strong for Sophia's sake. We must go on living." Anna didn't reply, looking sad. Edward patted her on the shoulder and left. She stood there for a while, trying to remember those feelings, and then also headed for the exit. Everyone in their department was given a week off to recover from what happened. But time passed, and the terrible incident gradually faded away. When Anna came to work, she saw flowers and various condolences on Sophia's desk. Sarah was still depressed, and even looked a little thinner. The others were busy with their work. Anna walked past and took her seat. She had a lot of work to do, and she was also working on a report with James. Working with him was difficult because he only threw short phrases instead of having conversations like, "Fix this here," "Recalculate there," and so on. This job could bring a promotion or a bonus to both of them, so they were doing it with a hint of enthusiasm. But their work was interrupted by the incident with Sophia, so they had to postpone it. Now they needed to continue the calculations. James approached her with papers and threw them on the table, saying that he had worked over the weekend and she should add this data to the report. Anna looked at them and was surprised. He had done a good job. So the day passed. She was absorbed in work, but still casting short glances at Edward. During lunch, Edward called her, which surprised her. It seemed like they were getting closer to each other. Finishing work and heading home, Anna was in a good mood. Leaving the crowded street, she went the usual way. It was a private sector, and there were few people here. With each step along this deserted street, the darkness seemed to thicken. Only rare streetlights, through flickering bars of light, tried to drive away the night shadows, but their efforts were in vain. The trees, trimmed like whimsical statues, created patterns of shadow and light on the ground. Anna felt a strange, inexplicable sense of unease when she heard something rustling behind her. Footsteps? No, more like a sliding, quiet, almost imperceptible. Moving forward, she tried to convince herself that it was just leaves being stirred by the wind. But there was no wind. The air was stagnant, thick and heavy, as if the breath of the night itself. Trying not to pay attention to the growing unease, she quickened her pace. But the fading light of the street lamps seemed to not reach the darkest corners of the darkness, leaving more room for fear. At the moment when the next lamppost suddenly went out, as if exhaling its last glow, the street plunged into almost complete darkness. Her heart beat faster, echoing rhythmically in her ears. The black spot that emerged out of nowhere began to take shape a few steps behind her. It didn't have a clear form, but instinctively she felt that it was alive, something following her with unwavering persistence. With each moment it seemed to grow larger and closer. Breathing heavily, she hurried, and her footsteps echoed louder on the asphalt than her heartbeat. Creaks, rustles, and indistinct whispers began to surround her from all sides. She couldn't tell anymore if these sounds were real or just a play of her inflamed imagination. But the sense of the presence of something unseen, something frightening and unpredictable, was so palpable that panic gripped her chest with an iron grip. When she turned onto the next street, the feeling of being pursued subsided. Here were people walking, and it seemed like she had entered another world. But what was that? Her heart continued to beat strongly. Her entire being seemed to scream about danger. She looked around, trying to catch her breath and regain her composure. The sight of chatting and carefree people gradually dispelled the fear. She headed home again, but this time chose crowded streets, vowing never to walk through that scary neighborhood again. The good mood she had all day simply vanished. When she entered the house, she locked all the doors. Only then could she breathe freely. This was her home, her fortress, and sanctuary. Relaxing, she took a shower, had dinner, and then headed to her bedroom. Collapsing onto the bed, she tried to fall asleep. The day had been hard, she had done so much work, so she just wanted to fall into the arms of Morpheus. But thoughts in her head prevented her from doing so. Although her body felt tired, her head was heavy, which prevented her. She remembered that terrible chase. Someone was chasing her, but who? So she lay there for a couple of hours, tossing and turning in bed. She even tried to distract herself and read her favorite book, Carrie, but the atmosphere of horror, when she was already scared, was inappropriate. So she pushed the book aside and just stared at the ceiling. But sleep still came. She dreamed of her time in the orphanage. There she had no friends except for a couple of brothers. They were always together, like an inseparable trio. But suddenly the scene changed. Before her appeared a river, dark and mysterious, like a mirror reflecting the night sky. Suddenly, children's hands appeared in the water, floundering in a desperate attempt to grasp onto life. The hands waved, creating splashes and circles on the water's surface, then suddenly disappeared into those dark depths. Anna woke up abruptly. Sitting up, she rubbed her eyes. How many times she had tried to forget that incident, but occasionally that scene resurfaced in her memory. Suddenly, she heard noise downstairs. She sat in the darkness, listening. The strange feeling of unease she experienced in her dream didn't leave her, even when she was fully awake. The noise downstairs grew louder as someone or something dragged heavy objects across the first floor. She slowly got up from the bed and headed to the door of her room. Every step on the creaky floor seemed like thunder in the dead silence of the night. When Anna stepped into the corridor, the light from the street lamp coming through the window on the staircase created ominous shadows. They distorted and reached out to her as if trying to turn into something alive. Descending downstairs, she felt a chill run down her spine. The noises ceased as soon as she reached the ground floor, and suddenly everything plunged into dark silence. Anna tried to turn on the lights, but pressing the switch yielded no results. The electricity in the house had been cut off. Exploring the ground floor, Anna noticed that books from the shelves were scattered on the floor, and sofa cushions were ripped from their covers. On the wall, illuminated by her flashlight, she saw something horrifying. Large scratches, as if someone with sharp claws had tried to write or draw something. Returning to the staircase, she heard a sound that made her heart stop. It was a soft, almost imperceptible hissing coming from under the floorboards. The sound was as repulsive as the rustles in her nightmare. Her gaze fell on the mirror at the end of the corridor. In its surface flashed a fleeting and indescribably grim reflection, but when she turned to look, there was no one there. Suddenly, the lights in the house came on, dispersing the darkness. Anna looked around, but it seemed like whatever it was had retreated, and there was silence. Only the disorder in the room reminded her that someone had been there. But who? Had someone broken into her home? She went to check the locks on the doors and windows, but there were no signs of forced entry. She pondered what to do. Call the police, but they would think she was crazy. Fear enveloped her. She realized that even in her own home she was not safe. What should she do? And who was it or what? She rushed into her room and locked the door, where she sat until morning. Falling asleep in such an atmosphere was impossible for her. She constantly felt like someone was standing behind the door watching her. In the morning, she headed to work. Dark circles were under her eyes. She was severely exhausted, both physically and mentally. She couldn't understand what had happened to her last night. and she had no one to discuss it with. If she told Edward that a poltergeist had settled in her house, he would think she was crazy, and then it would be the end of their relationship. Arriving at work, she sat sleepily at her computer trying to concentrate but couldn't. Even her colleagues noticed her condition. So the day passed. Anna headed home, this time choosing busy, well-lit streets. Passing by one of the shops, she glanced at the window display. In it, she saw her reflection, but she also noticed a black silhouette standing next to her. She sharply turned her head, but there was no one else there. Her heart pounded furiously. She looked back at her reflection, but the silhouette was gone. What the hell is going on? She cursed and ran. When she reached her house, she quickly rushed inside. Then she locked the door and went up to her bedroom. Standing in front of the door, she realized that something was wrong. It was a sixth sense telling her not to open it, but she still went in. She found that the entire room was covered with photographs, and all the walls were scribbled with something red. The inscriptions repeated and read, "It's you who killed her." There seemed to be no free space. Everything was covered. Upon closer inspection, she realized that the photographs depicted the dead Sophia. And what was even more horrible, none of the photographs were repeated, capturing the victim in various horrifying poses. Anna was horrified. She looked around but found no one. Then she inspected the house, but it was empty. My God, what should I do? She thought. Under no circumstances could she call the police. She realized she had no one to turn to, and her loneliness, which she had cherished all along, became her weakness. Sitting on the couch in the living room, she finally calmed down and, first of all, removed all the photos and burned them in the yard. Then she went to the 24-hour supermarket and bought paint. The whole night was spent repainting the walls. By morning, she fell asleep. She woke up to a phone call. It was Edward. He asked her if everything was all right. She said she was feeling a little under the weather and would take the day off today. Then she got up and checked the time. She had only slept for a couple of hours, and honestly, she was terribly sleepy. But she needed to do one thing. She went online and found an advertisement for installing surveillance cameras. The technicians arrived quickly. The installation took all day, but it was worth it. Anna sighed tiredly and collapsed onto the bed. Sleep came to her immediately. Waking up in the morning, the first thing she did was rush to her bedroom. Fortunately, everything was the same. Fresh paint sparkled in the morning sunlight. Has the nightmare really ended? Checking the cameras, she headed to work. Today she was rested, and everything was fine at work too. Edward invited her to lunch again, and James said he had submitted their report, and they needed to wait for the management's decision. Life seemed to be getting back on track. In the evening, walking down the street, she found nothing unusual. In a cheerful mood, she opened the front door and went upstairs. Standing in front of the bedroom door, she hesitated. Has someone intruded again? But today, everything was fine. Maybe there was nothing inside either. She opened the door and realized with horror that the room was again covered with writings and photographs on the walls. Again? What the hell is happening? Anna turned sharply and ran downstairs to where the camera recordings were kept. She started playback and began scrolling to the right moment when suddenly she pressed pause sharply. This was the moment when the weirdness began. On the monitor was her bedroom. Suddenly, photographs materialized out of thin air and began sticking to the wall, after which inscriptions began to appear on the walls. It was all so creepy that Anna clasped her mouth with her hands out of fear. Then she ran to her room, packed her things, and left the house. She could no longer stay here. Finding a hotel, she booked a room and finally sighed tiredly. Some crap is happening in her house, and she won't return there until she does. As she unpacked, her hands kept trembling. Fear wouldn't leave her. Taking a shower, she lay down on the bed, afraid to fall asleep. So she lay awake all night, but sleep took its toll, and she fell asleep. In the morning, when she opened her eyes, it seemed to her that she had returned to that nightmare again. She closed them again, telling herself that it was just a dream. But upon opening them again, she found that everything remained the same. Her entire room was covered with photographs, and the walls were scribbled with blood. This horrified her so much that she wanted to run away. But then she pulled herself together. She started taking down all the photos and putting them in a bag. Then, taking a rag, she began to wipe away the writings. It was impossible to wash the walls clean, but at least no one would be able to read what was written there. After that, she went to the manager explaining the situation. She pretended that she had a mental illness and such things happened to her. In order not to involve the police, she had to pay a hefty sum. After that, she didn't go home, but headed to work. Fortunately, no one noticed her leaving with her belongings. The day passed as usual. In the evening, she finally decided to return home. Everything was as usual there. She ended up sleeping in the living room. She didn't have the strength to clean up those photos. At night, she woke up to a noise. Someone was here again. She got up and went to the kitchen where everything was in disarray. She looked at this scene with a doomed look, when suddenly she heard noise upstairs. She rushed there. Her nerves were already shot. She was trembling all over. Events of the past days rushed out of her. When she burst into the bedroom, she found that all the closets were open and the things were scattered around the room. She screamed in anger, fear, and despair. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Then she collapsed to the floor and, slumping her shoulders, began to cry. Suddenly she heard a voice. "Who am I?" Anna looked up and in the darkness saw a pair of red, glowing eyes. It seemed they were hanging in the air, menacingly watching her. What kind of creature is this? She had no strength to run away and be scared. She just accepted the situation. She asked again, "What do you want from me?" "Nothing. I just found it amusing to watch you. You were so desperate that at one point I even felt sorry for you. And I decided to do you a favor. That girl who annoyed you. You were glad that I got rid of her, weren't you?" "You're insane!" Anna screamed. Hysterical laughter followed. After that, the pair of eyes dissolved into the air and there was silence. When she thought the creature had gone, she heard a voice saying, "If you ever want to get rid of someone else, just say so." After that, she sat contemplating his words. She would never make such a mistake again. She went downstairs and, collapsing on the couch, began to ponder what kind of creature it was and what to do next. But she couldn't come up with anything useful and soon fell asleep. In the morning, she went to work. Her condition was depressing. Nerves were on edge. Stress she had experienced over the past days took its toll. Her eyelid kept twitching, which annoyed her. Sitting at the table, she heard someone enter the room. It was the director of their company. He laughed loudly and went to James, shaking his hand, then patting him on the shoulder, saying he had done a good job and his report could revolutionize their business. He promised him a promotion and a big bonus, then took him away. James seemed to be in shock and wanted to say something but remained silent. He didn't even glance at Anna. She felt boiling inside. It happened again. She was ignored again. She did more than half of the work. but all the glory went to him alone. Her nerves were already on edge, and then this happened. She looked around and saw the sympathetic faces of her colleagues. Especially unpleasant was Edward's look. She jumped up and went to the bathroom. There she looked at herself in the mirror and muttered, "I hate him. I hate them all. I wish he would just drop dead. They're all driving me crazy." It was a furious and desperate curse that involuntarily burst out of her. Suddenly she heard a voice behind her. "Of course it will be done." Anna turned sharply, but there was no one there. Then she remembered what she had just said and realized what she had done. That creature had offered to help her get rid of someone if she needed to. "Oh my God, what have I done?" She rushed out of the bathroom and ran down the empty corridor. When she turned the corner, she suddenly stopped. There was a rope hanging from the ceiling, and James was hanging on it. His eyes were also gouged out just like Sophia's. Anna couldn't believe her eyes and took a couple of steps back. Suddenly, she heard a scream behind her. Turning around, she saw one of the company's employees who, with a frightened face, looked at this scene. Soon, people gathered. Trembling, Anna headed to her office and sat down at the table. When the police arrived, they cordoned off the crime scene and the interrogation began. Sarah, Edward, and Anna were called one by one into a separate room where they were thoroughly questioned. It was the same detective who was present during the first incident. When Anna returned, only Sarah was in the room. Her eyes were teary. She approached Anna and hugged her. Then, crying, she began to tell about James. It turned out that when he found out that Anna had been excluded from the report, he vehemently opposed it and argued with the director, saying that she had done all the work. He insisted so strongly that the director had to agree. Apparently, he was heading to our department to share the good news. Hearing these words, Anna collapsed to the floor. What had she done? Why couldn't she ever control her emotions? But then she heard words that shattered her entire being. Through tears, Sarah whispered, "You know, he loved you." "What?" Anna said, raising her gaze and looking at her colleague in confusion. "Yes, he loved you, but he was so shy that he was afraid to confess to you. Remember that burrito he spilled on you? He went to order it specifically for you. I kept telling him he should open up to you, but he didn't dare. He also suggested working on the report together with you because he liked you." After these words, Anna remembered all those looks he threw at her. But now it all looked different. In fact, he admired her, but he was too shy to express his feelings. Maybe he was the only person in her life who really loved her. And at that thought, everything inside her twisted and emptiness formed. She silently got up and headed for the exit. Walking through the streets, she didn't understand how she ended up at her place. She blamed herself all the time and couldn't accept this reality. Going upstairs, she found new photos in the bedroom, this time with photos of the dead James added. Collapsing to the floor, she took one of them and looked at it with empty eyes. It's unknown how long she sat like that, but suddenly she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw Edward, who stood with a stony face, looking at all the inscriptions and photos. His gaze wandered around the walls and his eyes expressed genuine horror. Then he looked at Anna and said, I was worried about you. No matter how much I knocked, you didn't answer. Then I went up to you, but what does all this mean? What kind of monster are you?" He took a step back. Anna reached out, whispering, "Wait!" But he only looked at her as if he had seen a monster. And turning around, he ran, saying that he needed to report this to the police. She screamed in despair. How? How did everything turn out like this? Something inside her twisted and died. Then she uttered only one phrase, "Kill." After that, a voice behind her said, "It will be done." Detective Harris had been sleeping poorly for the past few days. The case with the hanged girl haunted him. But when he was called back to the same scene where a new crime had occurred, he was even more disturbed. The footage from the cameras again showed how the body hung itself in the air. Watching the new footage, he felt his hands shaking. Yes, it was fear. That instinctive fear inherent in every person when they sense danger. And again, the first one at the crime scene was that girl. He conducted an interrogation, questioning her colleagues as well, and thanks to this he learned a lot. The girl had motives against both victims, but he had no evidence. But he still decided to dig deeper under her, feeling that the solution was connected with her. And he started from that evening when they were sitting in the Mexican restaurant. Heading there, he questioned the locals, but found out nothing. Then he went down the street where the suspect could have gone, while looking for surveillance cameras. Going a little further, he ended up in a quiet neighborhood. There was no one here except for an old woman sitting on a bench holding a cat in her arms. The detective decided to talk to her and asked if she had seen anything suspicious on that day. The old woman shook her head, and when he was about to leave, she said, "Oh yes, there was something strange that evening. I was walking with my cat when she suddenly ran into the bushes. When I found her there, I saw that she was trembling all over. Something scared her. When I was about to leave, I heard cursing. Some girl was walking down the street cursing someone and wishing death. Yes, she said horrible things, but I only remembered about the gouged eyes. Then I froze and waited for her to leave." This is it, thought the detective. First, he would go to her workplace. Maybe she was still there, and he needed to find out where she lived. When he arrived at the office, he saw that the police cordon had been removed, but several people were still here. He went up to the third floor and entered the department where Anna worked. There was only one girl there, named Sarah. She was surprised by his arrival, but he explained his intentions to her and asked her to show him where Anna had been sitting. After that, he inspected her desk and started looking through the drawers. In the first one, he found various office supplies. In the second, there were candies, many of them, and they seemed expensive. But he didn't find any wrappers. In the third one, there were photographs, and as he looked through them, he felt horror. They were detailed photos of the victims. He understood everything, and, calling on the phone, said he needed a warrant. After learning Anna's address from Sarah, he informed his colleagues and hurried to his car. When he arrived at the scene, he was faced with a neat two-story house. The front door was locked, so he pulled out his weapon and entered, cautiously looking around. The ground floor was empty, so he headed to the second. But before he stepped on the last step, he discovered a horrifying sight. On the floor in the hallway sat a girl, with a bloody man lying on her lap. His pale appearance indicated that he was already dead. Blood was everywhere, and the girl, sitting with a vacant stare, was covered in it. The detective ordered her to move away from the body and raise her hands. But she didn't react. So he approached her, pulled her away from the body, and handcuffed her. Soon, the police arrived, and they took her away. In her room, he found terrifying writings made with blood. Later, forensic examination showed that it belonged to the victims. Besides that, there were photographs. They also found files on her computer, proving that she had tampered with the surveillance camera recordings in the office. How she did it was a mystery. But it turned out that there was nothing supernatural about this case. The girl was tried, and she denied everything, claiming that it was some kind of ghost. But of course, no one believed her. She was sentenced to life in prison and sent to the local jail. It seemed like the case was closed, but the detective still felt that there were some inconsistencies. That this case wasn't as simple as it seemed. A year passed, and he decided to visit this girl in prison. Talking to the wardens, he found out that she was not liked there, and from the first days the inmates constantly beat her up. When she was brought to the conference room, she looked terrible. Covered in bruises, with a vacant stare, she reluctantly answered his questions. She kept repeating that she didn't kill anyone. Unable to get anything out of her, the detective left the prison. As he was leaving, he felt a sense of bitterness, but he didn't know why. Every part of Anna's body ached. Once again, she had been beaten up. At first, she endured it, but then she started fighting back. It seemed that her animal instincts had awakened in this place, and at that moment she became terrifying. After each fight, she was sent to solitary confinement. She had gotten used to it. Even now, after the detective's interrogation, she was being taken to solitary. Entering the room, she collapsed to the floor. The darkness in the room, she was used to it. She constantly had thoughts of suicide, but something held her back. Lying on the floor, she suddenly saw glowing eyes which she hadn't seen in a long time. These pair of eyes were watching her. Then she asked what he wanted. There was no fear or any other emotions in her. He replied that he was just curious to see how she was doing. After all, he asked the local inmates to spice up her days. So it was him, thought Anna. Rage boiled inside her. All the pain and despair she felt here, it was all his doing. And then she screamed. Why was he doing this to her? What had she done to him? Why? At first, he laughed hysterically. Then his voice took on a menacing tone. Don't you remember? What you did back then by the river. Have you forgotten what you did? By the river, whispered Anna. And then memories flooded back to her. She was 8 years old back then. Her parents had died, and she had been living in an orphanage for 2 years. It was located in a picturesque place, near a beautiful river. During that time, Anna couldn't make friends with anyone. She didn't understand why everyone avoided her, but one day a pair of brothers came there. The older one was the same age as her, and the younger one was a couple of years younger. Their names were Dean and Thomas. They accepted her, and they spent time together having fun. The older one loved his brother very much and took care of him. This sparked envy and jealousy in Anna. Subconsciously, she tried to separate them, but she couldn't succeed. It seemed like the brothers sensed it and started to distance themselves from her. But the final straw was when a young couple visited the orphanage, and Thomas caught their eye. Dean didn't want to part with his brother, but he was happy for him. Anna couldn't understand that. The foster parents didn't take him right away. Instead, they brought him toys and sweets every time they visited him. Once she managed to escape the supervision of the caregivers and went to the river. When she got there, she began to contemplate the water surface. Suddenly, she heard a voice behind her calling her. It was Thomas, holding candies in his hands. Standing opposite her, he offered them to her. But something inside her flared up. The sight of this little boy enraged her. The way he reached out to her. The way he looked at her with pity. All of it drove her into a frenzy. And then she pushed him. He fell into the water and the current carried him downstream. He struggled in the water, unable to swim. She watched the scene with a sense of satisfaction as someone pushed her and jumped into the water. It was Dean. He desperately tried to save his brother, but the current carried them both away. Anna sat by the river for another half-hour and then returned to the shelter, not telling the adults anything. The brothers were searched for a long time but never found. Remembering this incident, Anna looked puzzled at the pair of eyes hanging in the air. She couldn't understand how this creature was related to that incident. But as it stared at her intently, it began to materialize. First, the head appeared, and then the whole body. It was a middle-aged man, wearing an old black cloak that covered his entire body. His face was ordinary, except for a pair of glowing eyes and sharp vampire fangs that betrayed the monster within him. She tried to understand where she had seen him before and remembered it was Dean. Then she gasped, covering her mouth with her hand and backing away. He looked at her. And then he said, "Then by the river, I survived. We were carried by the current for a long time, and when I managed to get to the shore, I realized that my brother was dead. Despair overwhelmed me. I cried and wept, for I loved my younger brother so much. Besides him, I had no one left. But now I was alone. Despair turned into rage and anger. I wanted to kill you immediately. The scene where you pushed him kept replaying in my mind. I wanted revenge. But simply killing you was not enough for me. You had to feel all the pain and despair that I felt. For that, I needed strength. I wandered through the forest when I heard a call. Following it, I found a small hut where I found a book. To my surprise, it described the method of immortality and boundless power. I couldn't believe this coincidence, but I still started to learn. Time passed, and I ceased to be human. It was time for vengeance. But to my disappointment when I found you, it turned out that you were still so pathetic. At that time, you were studying in college, but even there, you had no close people. So I waited. Finally, you got a job, and someone important appeared in your life. That's when I started to act. You know the rest." Anna listened to his story and gasped for breath. She couldn't believe how life had turned out because of that incident. After all, she just wanted to live. She wanted to live. Reading her thoughts, the vampire said, "My brother wanted to live too. But when he showed compassion to you, you simply got rid of him. Just like you got rid of your colleagues." Anna was in despair. Her eyes darted around the room. She jumped up and screamed for security. She wanted to survive. She felt that her end was near. But the vampire just laughed. "No one will help you. They are all in a deep sleep. I forgot to tell you that for using these powers, my soul will be taken to hell. But I won't go there alone." After that, he grabbed her and enveloped her in his cloak. She screamed, but it was too late. They were both engulfed in flames so intense that they melted the bars on the door. Anna screamed in pain, but Dean only looked at her. There was no fear of death in his eyes, only a sense of duty fulfilled as well as peace. The flames burned them both, leaving behind only a handful of ashes.